All right, this video is going to be about breastfeeding, the basics of breastfeeding. All right, you may have heard that breastfeeding is really beneficial for infant development. True, there are just certain components of breast milk that are superior, that are better than anything we've ever been able to create. When we create formula, infant formula, it's good, it's healthy. It will help a child develop. It helps a child thrive. But breast milk is just that little bit of extra. And there are various correlations supporting health benefits of breastfeeding, like having fewer infectious diseases, less tummy aches, less ear infections. There's just a variety of evidence saying, yeah, breast milk is probably good. It's probably beneficial. All right. That being said, breastfeeding is never going to be a guarantee that their child will have no problems. I have heard parents kind of brag like, hey, I breastfed my child. I am taking better care of my child than someone who's bottle feeding. And oh, don't we love parent shaming? Don't we love parent blaming? Oh, that's so unhealthy. But also, they kind of talk in a way that indicates they think they are guaranteeing no problems for their child. And that's not how things work. Breastfeeding does not mean your child will never get sick. It does not mean your child will have no health problems. It doesn't even necessarily mean that they're not going to have any growth problems. Some infants do have difficulty digesting their own biological mother's breast milk. All right. So breastfeeding is awesome, but there are a variety of reasons, and here's where I get a little negative. And unfortunately, there's probably going to be, the negative part of the video is going to be longer than the positive part of the video. So I don't want to underplay breastfeeding good. Breastfeeding good. Now let's talk about barriers to breastfeeding. Breastfeeding is difficult and sometimes impossible in some situations. So we need to be realistic. We need to talk about some of the barriers to breastfeeding. All right, first of all, can everyone breastfeed? Can every parent who's taking care of an infant breastfeed? Well, no. In adoption situations or parental mortality situations, the person raising the child, they may not be the person who gave birth to the child, and so they may not have the option of breastfeeding. Now, there are breast milk banks. People can donate their breast milk. There's accessibility issues, there's cost issues, and this is not something that's regulated. Like, you don't know the safety of that breast milk. That's definitely an issue. And so sometimes people like to just say, oh, well, you can just use banked breast milk. It's like, okay, if you can afford it, if you can get to it, if you trust it, it's not as simple as sometimes people present it. Sometimes people will say, oh no, I've heard that you can induce lactation in a person. That is true. You can give hormones well ahead of time. You have to do it ahead of time. You have to prep the body and give particular hormones to make it think that it's pregnant. Because if you've got nipples, you got breasts, that includes men, you've got the equipment, and so you can induce lactation in an individual. That is not the person who gave birth, but it doesn't always work well. They don't always have the same output as someone who doesn't have the induced lactation, and so it can happen, but it's not easy. Let's say it's definitely not something that's easy to happen. What if you were able to produce breast milk? You were trying to feed a child. Is it going to work well? Not necessarily. Sometimes the infant has difficulty forming a latch, figuring out how to make things work. Sometimes they are allergic to their own, to the breast milk that they're being exposed to. They might have other digestive sensitivities. Infections can form. You can get infections on the nipple and inside the mouth of the infant, and that causes problems with breastfeeding. If the caregiver is on medication, sometimes medication, if it passes through the breast milk, if they need that medication to survive, obviously they need the medication. So they can't breastfeed their child because of medication issues. Let's talk about issues in the United States. First of all, got to go to work at some point. Most caregivers work. All right, even though if you watch sitcoms, no moms work. All right, but most caregivers work. In the United States, we do not have any kind of guaranteed maternity leave. Other nations do, but we have a situation where all we have accomplished in terms of legal protections for childbirth is you can't be fired for giving birth. We've got that. How long do you get to stay away from work? There are no guarantees. A lot of people have to go to work after just weeks, and in other countries that's horrific to them that you would go to work, you go back to work so early. So you go back to work after just weeks. Breastfeeding is going to become much more difficult. And some people will say, well, you can just use a breast pump. All right. Yes. First of all, breast pumps are expensive. The good ones cost hundreds of dollars. You do have to carry that with you. They can be heavy. You may work at a place where it is difficult to pump. There are a lot of places where they may technically have a place set aside where you can pump, but it's difficult for you to get there. It's impractical. It may be an uncomfortable place. It's just pumping is difficult. You have to be able to store that. You have to keep breast milk cold. So you have to have a storage place to keep it nice and sanitary and cold. You have to lug all the milk back and forth. It's difficult. It is definitely difficult. Some daycares are reluctant to give bottles that have breast milk versus formula in them because they have to, keep it cold and all this good stuff. There are definitely issues with having to go back to work. I know, I teach at a university where I would often teach classes that only have 10 minutes in between. Breast pumping usually takes at least 30 minutes. 10 minutes is not enough. And so even if I was able to find a good place, and often the place available to me was a bathroom, all right, but even if I was to go to that bathroom and try to pump, I would only have 10 minutes. Leakage happens, all right? A lot of times when someone is lactating, they're breastfeeding, they have to put these breast pads in their bra, in their shirt, to absorb the leakage, and sometimes it still leaks through. I had one instance where I was teaching and someone's like, and I'm like, I'm leaking, and then they're all weirded out because they're like, I don't want to think about my professor breastfeeding, because we're all weird about breasts in the United States. All right, so there are definite issues. Some people will say, hey, you should always do breast milk because it's better for the baby's health, and let's face it, it's free. Not really. Breast pads cost money. Breast pumps cost money. Even if you don't have to pump, your time is worth something. Breastfeeding is only free if you think that the person who is breastfeeding, that their time is worth nothing. All right. When you sit there for a breastfeeding session, you can be sitting there for 45 minutes. All right. You can't walk around. I mean, some people will brag that they can walk around while breastfeeding. A lot of people cannot. So you're just sitting there. That's time that's not spent on doing other things. And many people will do it and they'll say it's worth it, but it's just one of the many factors that makes breastfeeding difficult. When you are stressed, when you are sick, you might not produce enough. And some people cannot produce enough. Sometimes the child will have failure to thrive, and then because the caregiver is just not able to produce enough breast milk for them. Even when they do all the things that you do to try to increase your supply, sometimes it does not work. All right. And I'm not saying all this to say, oh, don't breastfeed, it's impossible. Just keep in mind, it's difficult. So I always like to say, you know what? Breastfeed as much as you can and celebrate all the breastfeeding you manage to do, because it is common that people are not able to breastfeed as long as they'd like. Now, it is generally recommended by the American Academy of Pediatrics, recommends breastfeeding for the first 6 months. Breastfeeding exclusively, where that's what they're getting. And then the World Health Organization says their only liquid for the first year should be breast milk. If you can do it, great. If you can do it, great. Celebrate that. Don't act like you're better than other parents, though. All right, but it's common for people that they either have to give up altogether because they just can't make it work. And another thing that people often forget is you can have supplementation. Supplementation where you give a combination of breast milk and formula. So this is a situation where you breastfeed until there's nothing more coming out, and you get to a certain point, there's nothing coming out. The baby still seems hungry, you give them a little formula. All right, so you give the breast first, and then the formula is like topping them off. I did have one child, they were having difficulty growing, they were having crying, constant crying. When I let the goal go, when I had the pediatrician say it's okay if they get something other than breast milk, when I let that pressure go and I just breastfed as much as I could, and then I gave them a little bit of formula, they stopped the constant crying. They started growing at a regular rate. All right. So, I'm a big proponent of, don't pressure people, that if they can't breastfeed exclusively, like they're not a real parent or something like that. Breastfeeding is great. Celebrate all the breastfeeding you can do. I like to say it's kind of like the difference between getting like canned vegetables and vegetables straight from the garden. Yeah, the vegetables straight from the garden, they're better. But those canned vegetables, they're still healthy. They still have vitamins. They still have health benefits. You can definitely grow healthy and strong on those canned vegetables. So don't shame those who need the canned vegetables. Don't shame those who can't breastfeed exclusively. All right, let's support parents.